Okay, I am going to start because that means you get the maximum information and we get the maximum time for discussion at the end, where I'm sure you have questions that you want to ask. So what you were doing in the... Oh, by the way, I should say I'm Jean Haysmith, and I'm from New Zealand, Nova Zelanda, and I'm a physiotherapist by background, although I don't work clinically anymore. I'm a full-time researcher and academic. Some of you may know my name. I'm one of the people who's involved in a lot of Cochrane systematic reviews on pelvic floor muscle training. So what you've been doing in the exercise you just did is you've been thinking about a pelvic floor muscle training intervention. It was a fictional one, grant you, but I think you probably recognised a lot of what was in it. And that, what you were picking up there were a whole lot of behaviour change techniques that were aimed at changing the patient's behaviour. And even more specifically, they were aimed at changing a pelvic floor muscle exercise behaviour. Now, you'll know there are lots of other behaviours you're probably working with your client group. Might be obesity, might be fluid management, might be constipation, might be a whole lot of other behavioural things that you're working with as well. But that was one specific thing we were talking about, which was an exercise behaviour. Now, in her presentation, Sarah asked the question about how much is behaviour change determined by an individual's motivation versus external influences. And what I'm going to be talking about a bit more now are these external influences. You've seen this diagram before. This is Susan Mickey's and colleagues' behaviour change wheel with the combi, the capability, opportunity, motivation, behaviour system in the middle in the green, and then intervention functions in the red, and then policy level things in the grey and the outer circle. Now, typically when I read pelvic floor muscle training trials, which is what I do a lot for Cochrane systematic reviews, the emphasis I find in those trials and any comments I find in the discussion on the success of those exercise interventions is often based on the patient's motivation. Now, the patient wasn't motivated. They weren't motivated, so they didn't adhere, so the exercise didn't work. Okay, and it seems to me that what I see a lot in the literature is this belief that motivation, the person's motivation, their reflective motivation, their active decision-making about their behaviour is the primary source of their behaviour, almost like it's the only source of their behaviour. And what I'm wanting to do in this section is challenge that idea. I want to challenge the idea that this is all about the person's reflective thinking motivation. I want it to think about a lot more than that. Okay. So, Chantal, remind me, how long ago was the ICS State of the Science seminar? 2011? 2011 in Glasgow. Okay. So in 2011, a group of us got together to think about pelvic floor muscle training adherence. One of the things we did as part of that is we looked at bringing together all the qualitative studies we could find about patients' experiences of doing pelvic floor muscle exercises. Now, on the basis of that synthesis, what we found is that there are some intervention functions, these things in the red, that both clinicians and patients, women and men, really felt made a difference in terms of their exercise behaviour. And these were education to increase their knowledge or understanding, both about things like incontinence or constipation and so on. And also knowledge and understanding about the exercises. Another thing that seemed to be very important was persuasion to stimulate pelvic floor muscle training behaviour. And one of the classic things here was a behaviour change technique you just named, which is action planning, for instance. This can be a stimulus to change behaviour. Another thing that was highly, highly valued was training to help patients acquire the actual physical skill and achieve mastery over those skills that they needed in order to do pelvic floor muscle training. And another thing that was valued a lot was generally enabling, this whole idea, for example, of problem solving, working with barriers and facilitators to the behaviour. So these were things that patients valued. There was one of these intervention functions, though, in the red that we identified mostly in the negative. Whoops, I was supposed to do those ones. And that's, the pink one is pointing to a word that says modelling. And in fact, what we found was mostly modelling in terms of pelvic floor muscle training is in the negative. So mostly what people hear is about it takes too much time, it doesn't work, it didn't work for my mother, my aunt, whatever. Okay? And so modelling in terms of the positive is about providing examples for the person to aspire to or to imitate. And you had one of those in that behaviour change technique exercise you just did, which was about providing stories to women of people for whom this worked. Okay? So one of the things that I guess that we're wanting you to think about, and in the behaviour change technique exercise you did, it was about that supplementary education material that had the positive stories in it. But one of the things I want you to think about today in terms of your interventions when you go back to practice is how much are you using positive modelling? Okay, can you counter negative modelling that people get a lot of? Okay, now one of the other things about this red section is there are some intervention influences here that we don't typically see in our literature, because our literature is typically focused on clinicians and patients as individuals. However, there are some intervention functions here in this wheel that I think exist nevertheless, even if we don't recognise them, and they act as very powerful external influences on the decisions people make and their emotional responses to a condition like incontinence. So, for example, incentivisation is about creating expectation of reward. But I want you to think here about what you see on TV when pads are marketed. What do you see? You see good-looking, slim, active, fit, engaged, happy, clean-looking people, don't you? That's what you see. What's incentivised? Wearing a pad, okay? So I want you to think about what might be going on there in terms of an influence that's acting on people who come to see you. In a way, it's an intervention. The pad companies know it's an intervention. And I'm not dissing pads, okay? Because, in fact, a lot of women and men that we see rely on pads to be socially dry, and they're very valuable product. Okay, and it's great that they're improving all the time. However, what might be disincentivised by comparison is something like pelvic floor muscle training. There might be nothing on the ad about going to consult with a physician or a physiotherapist or whatever. There might be something else you can do. Okay, so we'll just move on there. So I want you to think not just in terms of what's obvious, in terms of these intervention functions, but possibly some things that are less obvious. I want to move out quickly now to this grey area that we are more at the policy levels. You remember that Helena talked about it more in terms of the macro level, the things that are acting in the very big picture. Okay, so it's not just about what we do with individual patients, but all the messages they're getting from everywhere. Okay, and what I want us to think about is what from this grey circle could we be using better, or what could we be advocating for change in? So one of these that you would recognise straight away, I suspect, for example, is the one that says guidelines. We know that there are guidelines in specific countries, but more generally from things like the International Consultation on Continence, which suggest what best practice might be based on a synthesis of the evidence. Okay, the question is, at the policy level, how much are our policymakers, our service funders, aware of those guidelines? How much do they buy into them? And how much is it just left to us as clinicians to make decisions about implementing them? Okay, so what do we need to be doing at that higher level in terms of advocacy and change around guidelines, for instance? Another one of these grey ones, intervention functions, might be, for example, law or legislation. In my country, New Zealand, we have something called the Health Professionals Competency Assurance Act, which sets out what we are and aren't allowed to do in terms of our competencies within professions and what we get audited on in terms of being competent professionals. Now, I know that in some countries, vaginal examination is an acceptable scope of practice for physiotherapists, and in some, it's not. Okay, so this is something about what's happening at that much bigger law or legislative level, in terms of our professional bodies or in terms of law in our countries, about what might be within a scope of practice. I think you'd probably all recognise, here, this one right at the bottom called service provision. And the fact that as therapists, of course, we're working within funded services, and there might be constraints on funding and how that funding is prioritised and who has say about how funding is prioritised and what effect that has then on what opportunity our clients have to engage with our services. Another one, for example, might be regulation or rules. How many insurance companies have schedules of payment or other things that say you must receive your treatment here, or you can only have this number of therapy sessions, and how those things also influence who gets therapy and how much therapy and where they get it from and the expertise of the person they get it from. Okay, so again, at this big picture level. Okay. Now, mostly I've talked about these things in the negative, and a little bit later on, I hope, we're going to have some discussion, and what we're going to do is we're going to think about how can we become more broadly change advocates or change agents at organisational, professional and policy levels, those bigger external influences that we know have a lot of impact on what people are thinking and believing when they come and see us and whether they get to see us at all. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jean. Are there any questions for Jean before we move to the next section? Celia? Yeah.
I just want to make a comment about the, Celia from Australia, a comment about using positive role modelling stories. In Australia, there's laws about not using testimonials, etc. And I think when we talk about doing this better, I'm sure there's a way around it, but I just wanted to point out that sometimes there's a reason why we don't do that amount of testimonials.
So that one goes right out to the outer circle around legislation, yeah? What's legislated as possible or not. Now, one of the things I would ask, for example, about that law, is it testimonial about product? You know, can you have testimonial about a service which is like a health service publicly funded, for example, that isn't associated with an insurance company or a product of some sort? So the question is, what sort of testimonial are you talking about? If you're talking about success with exercise, is that covered by the same law as success with product? Do you know what I mean? So questions to ask about what's acting and how it's acting and whether we have a correct understanding of law or legislation that might be governing practice. Yeah?
Oh yeah, good question. Was good. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Celia. Any other specific queries for Jean? So I think you can see we've covered that people level, service level, and we've now hit the system level at policy. So we've moved through that health service delivery using fairly generic examples. So now Chantal will talk us through some very contextually specific examples. So think of all that theory and examples we've just done and apply it to this next section. Thanks, Chantal. The slides will be Dumoulin. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena.